So good morning. Good morning and welcome. Welcome here to Georgetown University. Welcome to this very exciting event we have today. We're delighted to be doing this in partnership with the Brazilian Embassy, with Fulbright, and especially Fulbright Brazil, represented here by Luis Loero. This is a real honor for us. At Georgetown, our Center for Latin American Studies, one of our main goals is to bring together dialogues across the hemisphere, dialogues that help us think about the shared challenges we have, the shared opportunities that we face, and to find ways that we can better work together. And we couldn't do it in a more perfect space than this one here at Georgetown University in this beautiful Riggs Library. This library was actually constructed, this building was constructed in the years following the United States Civil War, at a time when Georgetown was actively seeking to contribute to conversations that would build reconciliation, that would reestablish democracy here in this country. And it's appropriate that then today, as we talk about challenges to democracy, democracy that's challenged both here in the United States in a number of ways, as our speakers will highlight, and also in Brazil, with new opportunities for inclusion, but also new serious concerns about division, about inequality. How do we address those issues? That's what we seek to do today, and we do it in this hallowed space. We couldn't have two more ideal speakers to hear from than the two that we've gathered today. Dr. Francisco Weffort, a premier commentator on Brazil and on its politics, and then Dr. Abraham Lowenthal, who's been one of the most influential political scientists and thinkers, especially throughout the Americas. So we're delighted to have them here to address these issues for us. Luis is going to present them more formally, but let me just add my word of welcome here to this space and to this very important conversation. And just to highlight the way we'll be taking the day, each of the speakers will speak first, and then we'll have a conversation together in which I will moderate on the chairs after their initial remarks. Thank you, and welcome, Luis.
So it's a big pleasure and honor to be here today. We are celebrating, the Commission is celebrating its 60th anniversary in Brazil, and I could not imagine a venue more appropriate than this one. I didn't know the story about the building and the library, so I think this is 100% in accordance what Senator Fulbright had in mind in 1946 when the program was created, and it's amazing that it has been surviving over this 71 years. So without further ado, I want to introduce our two distinguished guests and grantees, alumnus, Professors Abraham Lowenthal and Professor Francisco Weffort. So Professor Lowenthal, he's emeritus of International Relations at University of Southern California, President Emeritus of Pacific Council and International Policy, founding director of both Woodrow Wilson Center, that I have a very important representative here, Paulo Sotero, and the Inter-American Dialogue. Professor Lowenthal published more than 15 books, and he also published more than 100 chapters of books and journal articles in scientific journals. He has been visiting fellow in many prestigious universities worldwide, the International Institute of Strategic Studies, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, University of São Paulo in Brazil, University of Buenos Aires, among many others. He has received an honorary degree from University of Notre Dame and has been decorated by the presidents of Brazil, Peru, Dominican Republic. He was also Fulbrighter in Japan and Argentina, and he's presently in Brazil. Professor Lowenthal sits on many boards, including the Pacific Council, the Inter-American Dialogue. He was a member of the board of the Fulbright Association, the Hubert Humphrey Fellowship Program, and many other organizations. Professor Lowenthal is currently a member of the board of the Leo Baeck Institute, and and the Alumni Council of Harvard's Graduate of Arts and Sciences. He has his PhD degree from Harvard. So Professor Weffort, that will talk just after I finish his introduction, is a emeritus at University of São Paulo. He has been member of the Department of the Political Science of this university since 1964. His academic interests include a political history of Brazil, political theory, and in particular democratic thought and sociological studies of Brazilian and Latin American populism. Professor Weffort is a distinguished scholar and public figure, presently at the Kellogg Institute at University of Notre Dame, under our sponsorship that honors us a lot. There he is studying social democratization and political democracy in Brazil from 1945-1988, focusing attention of permanency of patrimonial traditions in the face of the growth of political democracy. He has many publications, books. I will mention just two, freely translating from Portuguese, the titles, Building Brazilian Political Reasoning and Sword, Greed, and Faith. I'm very curious about this one. Before was Minister of Culture from 1995 to 2002 under President Fernando Henrique Cardoso's administrations. Additional academic appointments include Wilson Center Fellowship and visiting professor at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. So I stop here and ask Professor Weffort to talk to us. We have a lot to learn with you and with Professor Lowenthal. Please.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be here at this great university of the United States and of America as a whole, and talk about Brazil in a dialogue with my friend and my master, Abe Lowenthal. I have some written words because I thought it would be easier for me to explain my ideas about Brazil, democracy, a crisis in Brazil, with a paper in hand. The current political crisis in Brazil is the unfolding, from my point of view, of some imbalance and distortions that affect for some decades the institutional system of the country. We have had decades of history characterized by authoritarianism, striking rush institutional instability, notable urban spread, and extraordinary growth of economy since the years 30. In addition, we have had also a strong expansion of state and growing attitude intervention of the state in the economy and in society. This extensive process has been called by some sociologists, like Alain Touraine, as a process of democratization through authoritarian ways, which since the beginning plays this paradox: democratization through authoritarian ways. The point is that the crisis at the present moment leads the country to a surprising political paralysis that worsens by a severe economic depression in the country. In the history of Brazil, as common in such situations in America, in Latin America, and possibly North America, the crisis involves serious risks of political democracy in the country. The image of politics was consolidated in recent decades in Brazil as sometimes something apart from society, almost exclusive subject of grand states that predominate in parliament and the highest spheres of executive and the judiciary system. The means that they all think of institutional power of the country. Brasilia, headquarters of the system of institutional power hierarchies, came to be seen as the fantasy island that many of us announced in the year 60. The isolation of politics has become a general phenomenon, affecting institutional groups of power also in the states and municipalities. The corporatism and nepotism are widespread in all the activities of the nation, in an atmosphere that favors friends and benefits with benefits and stipends. Today, corruption has become a systemic phenomenon. Situations of political regression are not new in our history of unstable democratic development, but rarely do we get at some point of extreme situation that we see nowadays. Brazil in history is seen as a country of imperial presidentialism, weak parliament, and disbalanced federalism. We know that in 1988, in the Constituent Assembly, some representatives talked a lot about authoritarian arrests that we have as heritage of the military regime of 1964. It was not, however, the only arrests, the only junk inherited in our recent history. In times of the Constituent Assembly of 1945, 1946, we should remember the authoritarian legacy of the corporativists' new laws on trade union organization made in 1943, which since then has been applying both to the segments of businessmen and workers. In this way, the Brazilian presidentialism has authoritarian features that gives to the state, or to the power of state, possibility of being used without inhibition when eventually lacks democratic resources for the initiatives it intends to take. It's clear that the power of federal executive on the most provincial states through a complex network of resources that are our prize, both your removal can be worse as punishment. Today, this kind of imperial presidential power reaches, for better or worse, thousands of towns that spread in the vastness of the Brazilian territory. As said in the Brazilian tradition, favor for friends, for enemies, the harshness of law. All this bad tradition currently undermine the functioning of our representative democracy. There is no denying that we have freedom of vote and we have freedom of opinion. In addition to that, we could say that we left behind in the history of Brazil the restrictions that we lived under the weight of Cold War, which in those years limited or even banned political participation of certain segments of opinion, reaching extremes of prohibition and violence. In addition to freedom of vote, it's always good to remember, especially when it comes with a reference to a fragile democracy like Brazil, the free working of press and in general of the media. Under these aspects, we could say, one of the largest democracies in the world. All of us know something about 1929 crisis. Okay, if Brazil might be seen today, in a sense, as a modern society, at large measure, that modernity is born from that crisis. The 1929 economic and social crisis has had effects joined to an international context that, in the case of Brazil, arrived to the fall of the traditional liberal state and the fall of traditional oligarchies in the country, opening the ways for new social force, as well as for starting emergence of urban malaise in the politics. Those would be the ways for a beginning of democracy in Brazil. Of course, the renovation force were winners, but not completely. Let us give some descriptive numbers. Population in 1930 in Brazil arrived to 37 million people. 2,500,000 electors. In 1930 elections, the electoral effective presence arrived 5% of the population. Today, the Brazilian population arrives to 200 million people. And the electoral population goes to 140 million electors. Near to 70% of the population. Much more, anyway, than the 5% of the 1930. Recent research made in Brazil by Professor Jairo Nicolau of the Federal University of the country offers an impressive image of growth of the electoral behavior after the years post-1945. In the years 1945-1962, the population growth was of 60%. The electoral population growth of 150%. The electoral presence grew 139%. During the years 1966-1982, population grew 49%. The electorate grew 163%. And the electoral presence arrived 180% of growth. If you consider the years 1998 as a whole, the population growth was of 250%, the electorate 1,300%, and the electoral behavior 1,250%. I remember this percentage, this extraordinary growth of the country and of electoral participation, because with those numbers, we can think of the recent Brazilian political history as a fight between criteria of democracy, the representative democracy, and the practice of corporativist regimes. The history of the country is a history of a big contradiction. Since 1930s, the number of political parties grew up under the stimulus of law and of facilities, economic facilities. In the period 1945-1964, political parties remained, this was a democratic period, 1945-1964, remained among three main parties, and other 10 parties for ideological alliance, regional alliances, or alliances for convenience, which are very frequent in politics. Since 1985, the recent period of democracy, the number of parties grew beyond any kind of reasonable limits. Today we have 34 parties against 3 parties in the most recent history. 34 parties with representation in the National Congress. And probably these 34 parties, we have 10 with some real political meaning. The others are for ideological alliance, convenience alliance, etc., etc. Instead of serving, at least for formation of new governments, those additional parties serve to disrupt the atmosphere in which the new government should act. Beside these 34 parties, we have new 28 parties in the making, let us say. Let us say, knocking the door of the electoral courts for entering. What's the reason for that? The chance to get money, public money, which finance politics. I am trying to remember you that 1930, the year of 1930 and the year of 1945 are the beginning of the present crisis. Probably, even the scholars that studied the 1930, 1945 don't remember more how the flags of institutional reform, the flag of moralization of political customs, inspired those past years of renovation in the country. Those are the same flags today of renovation of politics today. Those are flags of the past. Something of the past is present today. In spite of the modernization of the recent times, the right of vote is affected by anomalies, as we have seen in the past. The main problem in the years 30s and today, presently, in a worsened manner, is the huge distance between representative and representants. According to the same opinion, the opinion of different researchers, most voters quickly forget the names of the members of the parliament in which they voted in the last elections. As for elected members, this time, for most of them, they forget quickly the campaign promises. This is particularly true for parliamentary elections. Probably it's less true for the executive elections in the provincial states and in the presidential country. But it means how is affected the system, the electoral system, by all this confusion, multiplication of parties. Another point I think is very important to discuss about Brazil today, about Brazilian crisis, is the institutional corporatism. The mentioned distance between representatives and citizenships was registered in the democracy of 1946, but not the contradiction between the representative democracy and the corporative democracy, which began in 1943 or 1945, inherited of the fascist influences of the year 30 and present up to date in Brazilian politics. In the years previous to 1945, the criticism of corporativism ideas was made by some liberals and socialists. And in the beginning, until 1946, this criticism was made mainly by a less known, not known as should be, a book by Evaristo de Moraes Filho, under the title Problema do Sindicato Único no Brasil, in which he attempts a discussion with the theory of corporativism of Oliveira Viana, probably the most important intellectual, this Oliveira Viana, of that time. The corporativism of Oliveira Viana meant not only workers' organization, but also the relations among the state and Brazilian community, entrepreneurial community. Oliveira Viana corporatist theory was a general conception of Brazilian society. This conception, beginnings of 1940s and alive up today, is the idea that Brazilian society is an amorphous society. That means a society unable to organize itself. In this sense, a society that unable to represent itself. And as a consequence of this theory, of sociological theory, the mission of organizing the society and making it able to represent itself would be, of course, a mission of the state. I want to say clearly here, among us discussing this kind of topics, that the theory of Viana is a different of the theory of Alain Touraine, because they have different criteria. But in a sense, the consequence of both theories analyzing the Brazilian society is more or less the same. The point, essential point for them is, mainly for Alain Touraine, is to understand how is the passing or how is the transition of a liberal society, traditional agrarian, oligarchic, like Brazilian, or like Argentina, in the 30s, in the 20s, to a modern industrial mass society of the 50s and the 60s. That's the theory. That's the problem of sociology. And that's the problem also of the point of view of political science that searches to understand how is this transition of the liberal traditional state to the liberal democratic state. That's all the points. And Brazil and Argentina have had an extraordinary influence in politics and in thinking of this kind of vision. Because of Salazarism in Portugal, because of Franquism in Spain, because of the influence of Mussolini from Italy, and probably the best theorists of all of them, helping the extraordinary influence of corporatism in Brazilian society. Just to give some numbers, to give some idea of how Brazil is a corporativist society. Some official numbers. In the year of 2011, some years ago, workers linked to the unions, to trade unions, arrived to 16 million. That's not much in terms of affiliation to the unions. The most expressive is the number of unions. The number of unions is something like 10,000 unions in the country. I say, why? Why so great number of unions. It's because the unions, in a sense, in the corporatist theory, are part of the state, and the state has to finance it. A great number of these unions don't work. Even as unions, they only receive money. Let's say, this is not only a problem from the point of view of workers, it's also a problem from the point of view of entrepreneurs. Because the influence of money of the state in the capacity of organization of entrepreneurs is there. I would say then that Brazil, the history of Brazil and the history of this crisis is this fight between representative system and corporativist system. And I would say that's the time in which this ends. I think that this crisis is the final period of the big victory has made Vargas in the years and 40s with his conception of state, Oliveira Viana's conception of society up to the present. Let's say we are at the end of a certain time, and I hope the beginning a new time, a times of a modern democratic democracy, not only corporativist democracy as we have. I will stop here saying that these topics, these points I have mentioned, are only some points. Probably it would be necessary, but I would have no time for it at the moment, to talk about electoral system, the working of electoral system, and the way of electoral financing system to the system of corruption that we have in the country today. But we will have the most sage word of my friend and colleague and master for that. Thank you very much.
I am very pleased to accompany my friend Francisco Weffort, Luis Loredo, and all of you who are gathered in this beautiful space to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the Comissão Fulbright in Brazil. I do want to say that it's a special honor and privilege to share the podium with Francisco Weffort. He is one of those people that I have most admired in my studies of Latin America, a person that has always combined wisdom, as you heard in the last few minutes, a sense of historical perspective and sociological awareness that is really quite special, with also an active participation in public life. And it's that combination of scholarship and activism that most motivates and generates enthusiasm from me, and Francisco is one of those people who inspires. Senator Fulbright believed that citizens in the United States and in the rest of the world would benefit a lot if more of them were better informed about each other's countries and cultures. His vision led Congress to develop educational programs and networks of communication and professionalism that have contributed greatly to international knowledge, understanding, and cooperation. All of that is more important than ever in today's complex and turbulent world. The professional women and men who manage the Fulbright and other educational programs deserve our very strong appreciation and support these days. It is they, after all, who have been on the front lines over the years of developing, strengthening, and projecting what is truly great about America. That is the support for open, fact-based research and rigorous analysis, and the openness to plural dialogue of ideas among people of different backgrounds, different political perspectives, different ideas. These are values being challenged today, and the work that the Fulbright program has done is all the more important. I've participated personally in the Fulbright program 4 times, twice in Brazil, in cooperation with FAPE in 2012 and with the University of São Paulo in 2017 and again next spring. These stays in Brazil followed up on earlier research trips I took to Brazil in 2006 and 2009. I concentrated during all these visits on trying to learn about how Brazil's society, economy, and politics had changed since the 1960s. I wanted to understand whether and how Brazil had made progress to realize the promise of a just, inclusionary, prosperous, and effective country that had for so long inspired but often disappointed the expectations of its citizens and of international observers. I found during these visits that Brazil had indeed succeeded, especially from the 1990s through the first decade of this century, in achieving greater economic growth, improved equity, and political stability. Its economic achievements were based on the stunning modernization of agriculture, major improvements in education and literacy, public health and social services, and the diversification of products and markets that allowed Brazil to develop international competitive advantage in numerous commodity exports, various industrial goods, and in such services as engineering, construction, communications, and finance. Perhaps most important, Brazil also had achieved a high level of stability of expectations about the rules of the game, that is, its political and governance systems and its policy-making processes. This stability of expectations, what Brazilians, I think, would call previsibilidade, liberated enormous forward-looking energies based on high confidence that the rules were clear and stable, and that any changes in those rules would be made gradually and consensually, processed through strong political institutions and a national culture of compromise. It also seemed that Brazil's compromise in the sense of give and take, compromise, compromiso is one of those words that's, it's not, the cognate is not, it's misleading. Not commitment, but give and take. It also seemed that Brazil's public, or at least its political elite, had achieved a high degree of convergence on major elements of socioeconomic policy, particularly commitments to improving income distribution, social equity, and access to justice, and also to strengthening in operational terms the presidential system in order to facilitate executive initiatives, checked, of course, by the rule of law and respecting the separation of executive, legislative, and judicial powers. Brazil also seemed committed to maintaining macroeconomic prudence in order to avoid returning to the crippling hyperinflation of the previous period. All of these achievements, which really impressed me as well as many others observers greatly, were underlined by the 2002 election, by the model transition from President Fernando Henrique Cardoso to President Luis Inácio Lula da Silva, and then by Lula's articulation and implementation during his first term of economic and social policies, indeed quite similar to those of Cardoso, reinforcing both economic and social progress and the expectation of continuity. As Francisco Weffort's presentation has underlined, Brazil today no longer seems quite so successful. Rather, he spoke of crises in Brazil's political institutions. Its economy is no longer booming, but has been stagnant at best, although in recent months there have been some signs of incipient recovery. The past 2 years, in fact, have been the worst economically in Brazil in many decades. Brazil's income distribution has significantly worsened in the last few years after a decade of improvement. Its education system has expanded in size and coverage dramatically, but has not improved much in relative quality in an ever more competitive world. Its infrastructure remains seriously inadequate, badly needing both greater investment and more rational allocation of resources from that investment which is undertaken. Citizen security is severely threatened. Intentional homicides in Rio and other states have reached truly alarming levels. Most strikingly, Brazil's governance is being undermined by gross corruption and massive public distrust. The current president has an unprecedentedly low approval rating and therefore devotes most of his efforts to retaining office. Public approval of Congress is not much higher, and Congress is often stalemated about whether to adopt important policy reforms, and even if adopting them, usually by watering them down very considerably. Coalition building to make Congress work effectively is vitally needed in the Brazilian system, as no recent president has had the support of more than half the Congress based on his own or her own party's votes. But the number of competing parties, which Francisco underlined, and their fragmentation and fluidity makes that coalition building a very difficult task. Federal judges and prosecutors, together with the national police, have been hyperactive in this situation of political vacuum, using new investigative and plea bargaining techniques developed abroad, especially in the United States. They have been operating at high levels of courage, boldness, and intensity, and have uncovered vast and serious corruption across party lines, involving a large number of senior politicians and a considerable fraction of Congress. Cleaning up gross corruption is an important contribution, of course, but the aggressive and independent prosecutions that have been underway raise serious questions about governability and even about the balance of power among the branches. In this context, after an extended period in which military intervention in politics that for so long had been common in Brazil, in which military intervention had become virtually unthinkable, it is now beginning to be discussed and debated. Public trust in the armed forces is higher than that for any civilian part of the government. Political parties have deteriorated into fast-changing constellations of ambitious individuals who switch parties almost at will to gain advantage. Campaign finance has grown to grotesque levels, legal and illicit. And the newly adopted campaign finance limits adopted precisely because of that kind of rampant campaign finance, may be too strict to be workable, and in any case, they seem designed to help incumbents. Polarization and distrust, rather than consensus and compromise in the sense of give and take, now characterize the Brazilian political scene. New political leaders are beginning to emerge without significant prior political experience. Some of them lack clear and coherent programmatic concepts, and in some cases they project deeply polarizing messages that violate long-standing norms for how people talk and develop political discourse in Brazil. In that context, repeated affirmations that our institutions are working are being expressed still, but with less conviction or credibility. The usual and attractive can-do spirit of Brazilians is being challenged by scandals and roadblocks that seem to multiply month after month, week after week. Now, I am trained as a student of comparative politics with an emphasis on Latin America. I have followed the political trends of many countries in the region, from Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean to Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, the Southern Cone, and in recent years, increasingly Brazil. During the several weeks I recently spent in Sao Paulo under the auspices of the Fulbright program at USP, trying to understand what has been happening in Brazil and why, which I have just briefly summarized, I was struck that the conditions I have been describing seemed in many ways more similar to those in the United States than I had ever imagined, and indeed less like that of most other Latin American nations and more similar to what we are experiencing in this country. I invite you to think with me about this for a bit, if you will. The political system of the United States, once thought of both here at home and internationally as a model of effective democratic governance, is now in serious trouble. An analytic review of the public policy process in the United States in recent decades. This is a nonpartisan statement. It applies during periods of Democratic Party and Republican Party dominance. An analytic review of the public policy process in the United States in recent decades shows an extended history of political gridlock that has precluded effective policy making on a wide variety of issues, from affordable health care and insurance to tax policy, from educational reforms to maintaining and modernizing infrastructure, from managing immigration to dealing with crime, narcotics, and the opiate epidemic that has taken more U.S. lives in each of the last several years than were lost in the entire Vietnam War. From Social Security and welfare reform to the looming challenge of global climate change and its consequences. The list of festering problems that have not been successfully addressed in recent years sounds indeed much like Brazil's accumulating backlog of inadequately addressed issues. If you think in the United States, we have allowed infrastructure to atrophy. I mean, think of many examples that we encounter in our daily lives in different regions of the country. Poverty has expanded in the United States. Income distribution has worsened. Debt has exploded. There are many reasons for concern. As in Brazil, public trust and confidence in the U.S. government, and especially in the Congress, have been falling precipitously. Less than 1 in every 5 U.S. citizens approves of how Congress does its job. More than 90% of the American public, according to public opinion polls, think the country is headed in the wrong direction. Public opinion data also shows that the fraction of the U.S. population that believes the government will do the right thing most of the time, that's the exact text of the question, has been declining steadily for years, from 76% in 1964 to 13% in 2016. Distrust of and disdain for the political elite have grown, providing conditions for the emergence of those who attack professional politicians of both parties, who ridicule and belittle those who compromise in the sense of give and take. Both major political parties, we still don't face 30-some parties. We've got two main political parties and just 3 or 4 or 4 or 5 small parties, which could be defined more or less in the same terms that Francisco used to describe the also-ran parties in Brazil. But both major political parties are in disarray, badly split internally and increasingly polarized internally and of course, with the other party. After more than a century of centrist politics in the United States, which used to be criticized as allowing choice only between Tweedledum and Tweedledee, the U.S. public, and especially its political leaders, are increasingly distant from each other, deeply antagonistic, disposed to exacerbate division rather than to forge compromise. Changes in residential patterns, people moving to be in communities where everybody has more or less the same attitudes that they have, reinforced by legislated redistricting of electoral districts to make that homogeneity within electoral districts all the more. Those patterns have balkanized the U.S. population into micro-communities, and those micro-communities no longer get their news and ideas from similar sources, nor from participating in community organizations in which people come together to solve problems, whether it be the school system or many other aspects of social life, not on the basis of general political attitudes, but rather on the basis of responding to particular interests and needs. They no longer get their ideas about politics and choice, neither from mainstream media of a nonpartisan sort, nor from participation in community organizations, but are rather exposed to so-called facts and concepts that are offered by outfits and people who share and reinforce their own core ideas and biases. In this era of polarized politics, campaign expenditures in the United States have also escalated to unprecedented levels. They doubled from 1980 to 2006. They rose more sharply thereafter, with a marked tendency toward greater campaign contributions from both ideological extremes of the spectrum. As in Brazil, campaign funding has skyrocketed, introducing new levels of concern about the influence of money on policy. As in Brazil, recent years have seen an acceleration of income inequality in the United States after a long period from the Second World War to 1969, when income inequality had in fact been declining. Since 1969, income inequality has steadily increased, and this process has accelerated in the past 15 years. And the public policy instruments that in the past were successfully used to kind of rebalance the distribution of income in a progressive direction through social policies and tax policies and the like, have all been weakened. And the current situation, the tax reform, which is before Congress as we speak, promises to reverse whatever progressive aspects there were to the tax system in ways that go exactly in the opposite direction with regard to taxes, health care, and other social services. Well, I would depress myself, as well as you, if I continued in this vein. But suffice it to say that people of very different perspectives and tendencies in the United States, from really very different parts of the political spectrum, are increasingly tending to emphasize what concerns them about this country, rather than why they think it's so great. And after many years when academic specialists on American politics had rarely expressed concerns about the political system of the United States, assumed breezily that a Democratic and Republican basis for governance was inalterably implanted in the United States, and that our issues were different, that we were not like those many countries in the world where democracy was always seemed to be contested and in doubt in so many parts of the world. Scholars are beginning to think and to write about whether, to what extent, and why democratic governance in the United States is threatened. At a recent workshop at Yale, for instance, scholars from several universities gathered to discuss the current state of and prospects for American democracy in comparative perspectives. Various participants there referred to democracy today in the United States as, and I'm quoting from different papers, eroding, deteriorating, backsliding, and deconsolidating. The participants emphasized the extraordinary degree of polarization evident in U.S. discourse, in the U.S. media, and in voting behavior. And they exchanged ideas about why this is occurring and what it means. If you turn on the traditional media or the social media right now, after I finish talking, and just spend a few minutes with the media, you will readily see evidence of that polarization. You will much less readily find explanations for this polarization. And to the extent that you find explanations, it's mainly that one side or another attributes to the other side an effort to introduce extreme concepts and thought which is destabilizing what otherwise would be happy consensus. In other words, polarization is attributed by some to Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and Mr. Miller and others pushing for this polarization, and by others to the opposite tendency. Among some scholars, I think, there is a recognition that we have had an artificial division in the teaching of political science in this country. Think of it, I'm sure it's true at Georgetown as everywhere else. We have a political science department which has a comparative politics section, international relations section, maybe a political economy section, maybe a political history, history of political ideas section. That's rarer now, but at Harvard they still pay attention to the history of political ideas, and a section on American politics, which is usually the largest single subgroup in the political science departments. But American politics is looked on as something special that has nothing to do with comparative politics. That's the way the profession grew in this country for reasons that have to do with the breezy expectation that there was something fundamentally different about governance in the United States from the rest of the world. I think people are beginning to realize that this needs to be questioned and that we need serious analysis and eventually serious public discussion about what is happening to our political system in the United States, understood not from a partisan finger-pointing basis, but rather by taking a longer run historical, institutional, demographic, technological, institutional, cultural series of approaches, similar to some of what Francisco was doing in talking about Brazil and its struggles between different concepts of society, which I think we need more of in this country. What I decided to do with this great opportunity to exchange ideas with Francisco and with the rest of you is to really make a proposal or issue a challenge. I think our understanding of our situation in the United States would be facilitated greatly by approaching the question in a comparative context. Not by starting out with the assumption that we don't have a problem. It's the rest of the world has a problem with getting democracies to work. But rather understanding that there are issues and tensions, dangers, opportunities. They vary in different countries and in different periods in different ways, but there are some inherent and recurrent challenges. And that we might learn more about how to think about those in this country by framing them in comparative terms and trying to understand which of the various causal factors have been the most important in our situation compared with other countries. And in that sense, perhaps simply because I'm doing some work in Brazil, but also I think because of some striking similarities that I just tried to touch on in my introductory remarks, it might be a really interesting and worthwhile, feasible, manageable, and I think very likely high payoff in intellectual terms project to compare the crises of the institutional crises of democracy in Brazil and the United States in a comparative way, and why not in a collaborative way. The Fulbright Commission has stood for collaborative exchange of ideas over all these years. It seems to me that it would be a very good idea for the Fulbright Commission and for other sources of support for scholarly work and exchange, for professional associations in the academic world, including the Latin American Studies Association, the American Political Science Association, the International Political Science Association, the International Studies Association, to foster comparative work of this sort. I think it would be a very good thing for think tanks like the Inter-American Dialogue, the Wilson Center, others to foster that kind of comparative work. I'm a tremendous admirer of the Brazil Institute that Paulo Cicero directs at the Wilson Center. But this, again, putting it into a comparative context might be an interesting idea. I think it would also be an interesting idea for the foundations that have supported scholarly work on key social challenges over time. And it is a very important challenge for universities like Georgetown and others, crossing the boundaries of Latin American studies versus other kinds of studies, and also not confined to one discipline like political science, but really trying to pose a question about the challenges to democracy, looking at it from different disciplinary and different political perspectives. So I, for one, am challenged by that question, but in a way that's characteristic of the way I've approached my institutional work over the years. I'm also inviting others to put more effort into this kind of comparative work. Thank you very much.
So thank you both very much for those thoughtful, careful, provocative, informative remarks. They've really positioned us well, I think, for a conversation now. And Professor Lowenthal, I want to emphasize towards the ends of your remarks, you warmed my heart because I am a comparativist as well. And always on the first day of class, I tell my students that American politics should be a subfield of comparative politics. It needs to be in the mix as we look at the rest of the world. And I think that's so important. You've really given us a great challenge that way today. I thought maybe what I would do is ask one or two questions of the two of you, and feel free to respond to one another as you respond in that. And then we'd like to open this up for conversation. We have about 35, 40 minutes to speak as a group. And I wanted to begin with the way both of you approached this question, which I thought was a very helpful one, which was to look at the long and deep-seated underlying causes of what we observe today. And I was struck by both how those can be somewhat seen in retrospect, but how much they were hidden for so long, or how much we didn't recognize them. You know, so the crisis, as Professor Lowenthal remarked, the crisis we see now really comes after we thought we were seeing a period of incredible growth, stability. The rules seem to be well understood, and now those rules actually are being called into question. And in fact, the corruption we're starting to realize was actually going on underneath earlier than this current period. And likewise, Professor Weffort, you spoke about the important roots lying in corporativism and that particular sociological and state organization. And so thinking about how those underlying roots now show themselves when in other periods they seemed perhaps either well suited to the moment or able to allow for certain kinds of positive growth. So I guess my question to both of you is, what's changed, or what about those underlying causes now shows their other side that maybe we didn't see as clearly before and now we recognize more clearly? And you might want to remark in there, because both of you mentioned it in passing, about either the electoral institutions, the electoral finance institutions. A number of these factors seem to be there in the background that now are showing another side than we recognized before.
You want to say?
Very good.
Well, yes, certainly what underlay both of our talks was that you need to look at these issues with their historical context and background. In the case of the study of American politics, there is a long tradition of looking at, for example, the politics of the South, of the southern part of the United States, as a special kind of politics. V.O. Key and all of his descendants, intellectual descendants. You know, there were good studies showing that this part of the country behaves politically differently from the rest. And then, you know, explanations of how that difference changed in partisan terms as the Democratic Party became more committed to civil rights and therefore to a changing balance of power between the races, and that, you know, when the Democrats took certain measures, particularly the Civil Rights Act, as Johnson passed it, he has reported to us that, well, we've just lost the South for the next generation or two. So all of that was an understood part. But recently there's been a very good book. Unfortunately, I don't have the author's name firmly in my mind, but I can send it to you if you want. But there's a book that looks behind that descriptive sense of the difference of the South, basically to arguing that the southern part of the United States had an authoritarian political system, which only in basically our lifetimes has become much more of a democratic political system. And it has to do, obviously, with slavery, race, the Civil War, Reconstruction, the ending of the Reconstruction period, and the adoption of political techniques and types of organization that made for a very different kind of politics, which was expressed in terms of these differences that Key and others noticed, but really not at the level of fundamental difference that this book points out. I think that we need more insights of that sort. I think at the very end of my talk, I said, you know, if we want to study these things seriously, we have to look at it from different perspectives. We have to look at demographic changes, including the effect of immigration, as well as difference in the nature of families and all kinds of related questions. We have to look at it from the standpoint of how the media works, how it's organized, how it's marketed, which has changed remarkably very quickly. We have to look at the effect of technology, which has also changed in remarkable ways. And again, I think if we do that, we will quickly move away from thinking that there's a simple explanation for our political difficulties, which is that some scoundrels, and you can take that as you will from one side of the political spectrum or another, are responsible for this mess, and all we have to do is throw the scoundrels out and we'll be restored to you know, a very good situation, and rather recognize that what we see as the effect of scoundrels is the symptom and the result of something rather than the cause of something.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Professor Weffort, would you like to respond as well, or?
Look, I think a very interesting point for working together, students of Brazil or Latin America, Institutes of America. For example, for me is very expressive the presence of Roosevelt ideas, Franklin Delano Roosevelt ideas in Brazil. Not only in Brazil, other countries. the mind, the intellectual mind of ours, of Latin America, is much more European, much more French or German than American. But in the period of Vargas, which is our period now, we are, in a sense, sons and, how do you say that? We are, in a sense, sons of the history of Vargas, even against Vargas. But doesn't matter. The influence of Roosevelt is strong, very strong. We could be a fascist country, or we could have been Brazil very similar to Argentina. Argentina has made a choice during the period of entering the Second World War. Not the case of Brazil. And I think this is very important for the moment. It was very important in the end of Second War, with the Economic Commission, Brazil, United States, called in Portuguese Comissão Brasil Estados Unidos. This has had a very, for example, the polemics in the economic thought in Brazil, in a sense, was born in this period, you see? And this is not very well known in our country. Let's say the presence of these ideas, the presence of the American influence from the point of view of the democratic development of Brazil. It's not very known. Say, I agree. I think it's very, from other point of view, for me it's very interesting coming in certain moments to the United States and see people talking about the Latin Americanization of the United States. I don't think so much, but anyway, until the elections, the governor of governors, in which it seems to be that America becomes America again, a lot of people asked me questions, what is the similarity entre American populism and Brazilian populism? Look, again, about comparison. Populism in Brazil is a very important topic. And populism is an influence, is American influence since the beginning. In the political history of Brazil, even if you, I didn't know that, but that's true. Populism came here, was born here. And Brazil was a big influence in Argentina too. They say the similarities between the histories of United States. Another point, the problem of slavery in Brazil, the influence of abolitionism in Brazil is an American and English influence, very rich influence. So that is to say, I think that we have histories coming back to a point suggested by Lowenthal, of similarities, of probably a lot of difference too. But anyway, what is strange is that we don't study these similarities. What is strange is that intellectual public in Brazil knows better the history of political France in the 19th century. You know, than the history of America. So I think it's very important.
Yes, please.
Just one or two sentence intervention, just because I've learned that serendipity sometimes produces the most interesting consequences. Francisco began that comment by saying that Franklin Delano Roosevelt had an influence on Brazil in different ways. I worked on various countries, as I mentioned. I don't know how many of you in the room recognize the name Teodoro Petkov. Teodoro Petkov is a Venezuelan political leader who began his career as a guerrilla, ultra-left, Marxist, Leninist guerrilla, real honest-to-goodness guerrilla. He moved away from that position, by the way, in the Soviet-dominated part of the Latin American left. He moved away from that position out of disgust for the Soviet Union's intervention in Czechoslovakia, which he just thought was, completely against the values which made him a Marxist. And so he then had a long political evolution, and in fact was one of the most admired and effective opponents of the strengthening Chavista movement as it became more and more authoritarian. In a long conversation with Petkov years ago, he told me that his political hero was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And once he said that, I could see the consistent commitment that Petkov has had, that he has had through all of these political changes. He's had the same basic attitude toward politics, and that's Roosevelt's attitude. It makes it easier to understand how he switched from different positions, became a member of the Venezuelan establishment in a way, having been somebody ready to overthrow it by force.
No, it's a remarkable story, and it really makes me think, and I say this sometimes to our students, those especially who are studying Latin American studies here at Georgetown, is how much our study of the region can affect our understanding of politics here in the United States. And perhaps no commentator has been more important in that than Guillermo O'Donnell, when we think of his incredible contribution. And just recently we were talking about the concept of delegative democracy, and so much of his concern and later in life, especially around the quality of democracy. And I think it's actually a moment where those of us who have studied Latin America have something to contribute to the conversation here. And were he still alive, I think his comments would be something that, likewise, it's that long development of a posture and a perspective on politics, and especially on democracy, that makes such a difference. I'd like to open this up to questions, because I know we have a number of people that have come, some from a great distance to be with us. So please, if you'd like to ask a question, we have a microphone for you.
Morning. I'm Paulo Sotero, director of the Brazil Institute at the Wilson Center. Question along those lines of trying to compare the experiences in Brazil and here. There is a book out by Professor Mark Lila from Columbia University called The Once and Future Liberal. That is a very interesting criticism of what's happening here now, basically after the 45 years of what he calls the FDR disposition, which was a social democratic kind of construction in the United States, that replaced by the Reagan disposition, which is the state or the government is the problem, not the solution, which exhausted itself, and he sees that the election of President Trump as the end of that, opening a possibility for liberals to understand what happened and propose something different and new. And it's very critical. He's obviously a Democrat and very critical of the Democrats. Now, in Brazil, I don't know if whatever we are living, it looks like our state capitalism system has exhausted itself. We can no longer finance, the Brazilian society is not willing to finance the size of the state we built. And we are in that discussion. And that's where I think there would be interesting comparisons to. And I just wanted to throw that because to you, because it is something that we don't know where we are headed in Brazil, but it looks like in both countries that seems to be a premise that regardless of what happened, we are going to look for a solution in democracy. That seems to be the will. If we are capable of doing that is another question. But just a comment.
Paulo, you know my wife, Jane Jaquette, my better half. She's just read Mark Lilla's book and is talking to me about it in terms like what you did, but I haven't read the book yet, so I wish she were here to respond to your question. But it does sound like a very relevant way of looking at the issues, and again, another basis in which some comparative work on Brazil and the U.S. might very well be illuminating in each country as well as in terms of the relationship.
I know we had another question over here, yes.
Susana Cabeza de Vaca, I'm the director of the commission in Ecuador. I want to add a little more piece to this puzzle on what you think the Chinese are going to have. What type of influence will the Chinese have on the future of the democracies in Latin America?
The influence of the Chinese in Latin America. She was asking, what influence do you believe the Chinese will have?
She is asking what impact or influence China will have on Latin American thinking about democracy.
Now, it's a question. It's a hard question. Well, I would think that China, well, they are having influence over the world today. In Latin America, I don't think much, with the exception of economy, of the market. The working of the market. China, of course, it's a very important, for example, relations between China and Brazil in the economic side, because they are market, they are important part of the market. But from the point of view of political history or cultural history, I would say the obvious. They are another civilization. Previous to all the history of this century, in the previous century, in the other century, they are other history. They say it's very different. It's very different as a civilization. Probably on the technical side, on the economic side, I have been one moment for some days in Peking, well, I was very impressed because they have interest in us. They have interest in Brazil. They have people learning Portuguese, for example. They have a lot of people studying English, of course, etc., etc., etc. But talking in Portuguese, they are o Império do Meio. They are the middle, the empire of the middle. This is a kind of conception of the world. They have some interest in certain culture from ours, But I don't think it's so important. But your question is a question about the present, but mostly, possibly, about the future. Of course, if they grow much on the economic side, my God.
Jay, please.
I'd like to make two comments about that. Stimulated by your question, there may not be a satisfactory answer to your question, but at least they're stimulated by it. First, in terms of the likely influence of Chinese ways of thinking about political organization and governance as distinct from the economic impact of China as a major player in the world economy in terms of trade and investment and so on and so forth. But in terms of political ideas and institutions, my olfato, my instinct, would suggest that it's not likely to have a big impact, in part because it isn't, I mean, it has so many aspects to it that are problematic. I mean, for example, Latin America is gripped today by the issue of corruption in so many different countries. I happen to have a good friend, Min-Jin Pei from Claremont McKenna University, a fellow student of Huntington. I've known him for many years. Min-Jin Pei has put out a brilliant recent book on corruption in China. It's amazing how a very good researcher whose native language is Chinese, because he's an immigrant to the United States, how much material there is. You would think studying corruption is hard anywhere. Studying it in China must be, it's an authoritarian government and so on, it must be impossible. But he has documented a study of Chinese corruption because the Chinese publish reports of cases in the courts, and he has no difficulty reading these cases, and he's studied hundreds of cases about corruption of various kinds, and there's some overwhelming cases that have made the world press, but there's a tremendous amount at the regional, provincial level, and so on and so forth. In any case, China hasn't solved the problem of corruption in its political system, ni mucho menos. It's really rife with it, and there's a tremendous amount of discontent in China with the political system. And in terms of having an influence, as I say, it does not, I mean, it is a model for transforming an overwhelmingly rural, overwhelmingly poor society into a modern society through forced means. But that's not Latin America's problem today. I mean, Latin America is beyond that stage. The other comment I would make is one that is not related to what you had in mind, I think, but being in Washington, which is such a self-centered and present-minded city, always has been. I'm aware of the fact that Latin Americanists, whether they're at Georgetown Center for Latin American Studies or at the Wilson Center or any other place, Latin Americanists in this country are always looking for a way to make Latin America seem more relevant to the powers that be so that they can get funding and they can feel more important and so on and so forth. And they're always calling for more attention to Latin America. And they vary the arguments in accordance with what they think will sell, like marketing toothpaste. And one of the tendencies one can see if one's been around the track as long as I have is that the latest gambit is the Chinese are so present in Latin America, they'll be all the more present. It's really important if we're going to defend and protect our country that we really understand what the Chinese are doing and protect against it and so on and so forth. Well, I think this is about as convincing a reason for paying attention to Latin America as many other previous examples. I mean, there was a tremendous emphasis on the Soviet Union and its influence on Latin America, and you know, where is it? I mean, what's the lasting impact of the Soviet Union in Latin America? So I just, being in Washington, I'm just throwing out a reminder that this is a tendency that we should be self-critical of. As I say, it had nothing to do with your particular question, which was not from that angle, but it's worth thinking about that when we're talking about China in the Latin American context.
We could take maybe one or two more questions. Why don't we take two of them, collect them, and then let you both respond. So I see Tony up here and then back there. Let's start here first, yeah, Tony.
Okay, hi, my name is Tony Quintanilla. I'm a graduate student here at the Center for Latin American Studies. As you know, a couple months ago, there was a general who talked about what role the military might play in kind of helping to fix the mess in Brazil. And so with the history of a professionalized military, I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on that, whether that is a threat to democracy in Brazil, you know, especially since you mentioned that many citizens in Brazil trust the military more than the actual government today.
He wants to know what... General, I mean, the comments by Bolsonaro, he didn't refer to him by name, but I think he was referring to him. No? Ah, okay. The reference by a military officer to the role of the armed forces in the political crisis in Brazil, is this something that, how should we think about that? That's his question.
About Bolsonaro?
No, about the comments that were made by was it a
General.
Eh?
Yeah.
Well, I would say that this is in a sense, is a question about China too, because it's a question about the future, really. The military now, with the exception of 2 or 3, are mute, don't speak anything. Which, in the case of Brazil, not only the case of Brazil, but in the case of Brazil, is a very important silence, because it's a deliberate silence. They don't want to speak. They they passed the idea that they understood that democracy is a problem of all the people, with the people, all the people. They are mainly, they are a small part of that. Well, this is a kind of a note on the world of ideas, but the fact is that the military tradition in politics is beginning in the 20s. It's beginning we call the old republic. The military of right or the military of left are more or less in the same school in the 20s. Prestes, Luis Carlos Prestes, an important leader of the communists in a part of the Brazilian history, was a colleague of other military of the right wing in same school, etc. This is a part of the, this is a part of history of Brazil in a certain period. All these people is dead. They have done their part in the history, for good or for worse, but they have done what they so possible. The new people, the new generals, don't have interest in this past. They are not even socially, even in terms of a social extraction, of the same kind of people, because those military of the Brazilian past, in a certain sense, were part of the aristocratic republican history of Brazil. That's not the case of this one. Is one point. And the other point is that the Cold War finished. The world changed. The world in which the military interventionism in Brazil and other countries worked was the world of the Cold War. So I don't know. 2 or 3 militaries now say something, but the real commanders, the guys we would speak in the past, with 4 estrelas, with 4 stars, the guys they don't like this. They don't want this. This is not our problem. Now, I am talking of the present, but if we take 10 years more of political institutional crisis married with economic crisis, etc., 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 but we would go back to the past. See, that would be possible. But in terms of future, difficult to imagine today. Nobody thinks of that. Nobody proposes nothing.
Let's take one final question back here.
Logan Smith in the Graduate School of Foreign Service. I wanted to see if either of you would be willing to give us some predictions or some expectations for the upcoming presidential elections in Brazil, especially given polls showing that, were it held today, a runoff would be between Lula and Bolsonaro. So what can we expect as far as challenges to democracy if there is, a heated and very divisive campaign, and maybe the effects of either presidency, another Lula or Bolsonaro?
He wants you to comment about the next presidential elections in Brazil.
The next presidential?
Yes, how you see the
future is coming.
Yeah.
The future is coming. All right. No, I think there's a very interesting question, because this doubt, this question is the question of the present in the political game, in this miserable political game of Brazil, is this question. Who could be the next president? Well, the election is sought for 2018 and October. Let's say we have a time. In terms of Brazil, this is a real big time, because in terms of Brazil, it's much time. Personally, let me give you my personal reaction. I think that before coming the election, we should have a political reform. We should have an institutional reform. We should have a new electoral law, changing our pasts. we should have a chance of making new parties. Because with that thing we have today, we will have no elections. Because the election, the question would be, choose José or Pedro. The question would be, in political language in Brazil, we call the fulanization. That's it, the personalization of the choice of the president of a country with 200 million people. It's not possible anymore. It's not possible. Let's say the country is so complicated, so big, that I don't believe that a choice of the cardinals, with all the due respect to the church, with all due respect to the church, the cardinals or the false cardinals of Brazilian politics could choose a president of Brazil. It's impossible. This is an oligarchic tradition. This is oligarchic the years 20s, 30s, 40s. Not anymore. So we will have prepared the country for a democratic election. Some people talk about, I don't remember even the names, the elected mayor of São Paulo. São Paulo is a big city. Big city. Anyone who is elected governor of São Paulo or governor of Rio thinks that next steps being president, this is next step being president of the republic. You see? This is not possible anymore. It's not possible. It is very difficult. It's possible to be a candidate, but chance with being elected with even the governors of São Paulo. São Paulo is more or less the time of Argentina. Okay, you can have the control political of São Paulo and don't have the control political of the Northeast. It's too much complicated. I want to give you this sensation. I think that we should discuss how organize the elections, how organize the elections in the municipalities, in the provincial states, how organize the election to change the system. We have a PR system, proportional representation system, which was very good in the 30s, in the 40s possibly, but not now. We will have to change for a thing similar to the American system. I don't know, possibly not. But anyway, or something similar to the French or to the German, or similar to we should think other system. It's not possible in this way. See? That's my impression. We will have to suffer this crisis for 1 year and a half, anymore, facing the future.
Please.
Time limited, let me use the time to make one comment about the past, which is much clearer in my mind, and then a comment on the future based on that question. In terms of the past, Francisco emphasized in his original remarks the gradual, the striking expansion of the electorate in several phases from the 1930s to 1964, and then after in the beginning in 1978 and into the 80s and so on. Just explosion of what the electorate was. Fernando Enrique Cardoso was a member of the academic council of the Latin American program at the Wilson Center when I was running that program. And we had our annual meeting discussing various aspects of the program. And we had a scheduled lunch with no program, just having lunch. And I was walking with him into the room where the lunch was, and he had just run for his first election for the Congress in 1978 as an alternate candidate. And we were walking into the room, and he was, chatting, and I suddenly said to him, totally without any pre-thought, spontaneously, I said, we don't have any program over lunch, but I wonder whether you would be willing, with our intimate group, to just share some ideas about your recent experience. He had finished the thing 10 days or maximum 2 weeks earlier. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about your experience as a candidate in electoral politics in Brazil that you just had? And he said, with his characteristic charm, well, why not? I haven't spoken about it even in Brazil yet, but why not? Sure. So without any advance notice, he gave a talk about his experience as a candidate. And it was absolutely fascinating. The first thing he said was that when he decided, and it took some discussion with his wife and so on as to whether he would go forward with being a candidate, when he decided he would do it, he said the first thing he concentrated on was realizing, organizing his thinking around the proposition that the electorate that was going to vote in that election was totally different from any previous electorate in Brazilian history, that it was very different from the 1960s, and therefore that to win elections, you had to understand that and concentrate your campaign on those who had never previously had the opportunity to vote, because that's where the votes were. Like, Willie Sutton was asked why he robbed banks, and he said, because that's where the money is. So he went where the new votes were. And then he told us all about his campaign, of which is the thing that struck me in my mind many times I've thought about it. He said that throughout his career up to that point, he was used to being a very well respected and received lecturer who would give lectures on different subjects, and that he did well at it. He knew he was good at it. And he said the thing is that people in that circumstance came to hear my ideas and to hear me speak. And all I had to do was to respond to what they were there for with what I could offer, which was a good transaction. He said, when I got into politics, I quickly came to understand that the people who were coming to the event where I was speaking were coming to a happening. They were coming to an event. They were not coming to hear my ideas, to hear me speak. And it took me a little while to understand that I'm not really talking to the people who are in front of me, several thousand people who are there. They are not interested in what I have to say, and they're not there to hear what I have to say. I have to keep them interested and engaged while delivering some few simple points to the journalists who will cover the event, who have to say something substantive beyond that there were a lot of people there. And so that part of my talk that is aimed at ideas is aimed at a very small audience, which will then transmit it. But that's a very different kind of talking. And it was just fascinating to watch him learning the profession, which he turned out to be so spectacularly good at. The classic statement from the baseball sage Yogi Berra that it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future, applies to your case about the Brazilian elections, and applies all the more so to a non-Brazilian, non-specialist who doesn't have the background. But I would say that from the limited knowledge that I have intensified by these several recent weeks there, the way I think about it, because I'm not a practicing journalist that has to say in tomorrow's paper who I think is, going to be the candidates and who's going to be the winner, and there are too many variables like whether Lula will be allowed to run and so on and so forth. But I think the logic of the situation, to me, is the most attractive candidate will be someone who occupies the political space that Lula occupied in his first successful election. That is somebody who has credibility and reputation as an inclusionary leader directing his or her appeal to a significant extent to those who have not been fully incorporated in the system on the one hand, but who also projects credibly, as he did after his letter to the Brazilian people and his various supportive acts, also projects a credibility as somebody who will pay attention to the orthodox concepts of the economy. That's what the times call for in terms of a Brazilian presidential candidate, both from the governing standpoint and I think even from the electoral standpoint, because I think there's an awful lot of people who were burnt by seeing what happened to the economy in the last period of the PT governance. So whether the candidate choosing processes, including primaries and polls and organization and so on, and I agree with Francisco that sort of the classic methods for doing this, I mean, just as in Mexico, the classic method of democracia, couldn't be sustained forever. So I think that these are different times, they're different processes. I don't know how the processes will work out, but my instinct is they will produce at least one of the two candidates will be somebody that fills that political space, and that person will win. That'd be my guess.
Thank you. Thank you both, Professor Weffort, Professor Lowenthal. Thank you for this really marvelous conversation. Let's give them a hand. And before we close, I just want to say thank you to all of you for coming today, for accompanying us in this really important conversation that has been, I think, wonderfully free-ranging. We've been able to touch on a lot of different issues and see real points of contact and comparison between our countries. We look forward here at Georgetown to continuing to work with the Brazilian Embassy, especially to continue to work with Fulbright Brazil, which has been such a huge supporter of this particular effort today, and so much important scholarship between Brazil and the United States. So again, thank you for coming. Thank you, Luis, for organizing this with us. Thank you, Regina, for all her work behind the scenes to make this happen. Elsior for helping to bring us all together. Thank you very much for coming today, and enjoy the rest of the day.